Okay, it's the end of January. Winter blues are kicking in for a lot of you. So it's time to start thinking about growing some greens, thinking about spraying flowers, vegetables, and getting a game plan on those gardens. And that typically starts in January with determining whether you're going to start things from seed or if you're going to buy in finished starts in the spring for instant growth. Many of us want to stop playing around with some plants right now and start getting our hands dirty again. And it starts with figuring out what you want to grow. All right, so once we start thinking about the spring, we start thinking about our gardens. Many of us start looking at our racks and just come in and they just see countless plants or seed racks and you don't know where to start. You start picking away and you're like, oh, this looks interesting, that looks interesting. And the next thing you know, you've got a bunch of seed packs and don't know what to do with them. I'll gladly sell you that many. But I recommend that you first start with figuring out what it is you're even looking to. Get a little bit of a game plan. You can play with it. You can add on some few things. But for most of us, we don't have a greenhouse worth of space in order to start hundreds of plants. So you want to be strategic on what it is that you want to grow. And are they looking for flowers or vegetables? But not all plants even want to be grown indoors. Many of them, like a tomato, has a long season, and so they handle tolerating the conditions of growing indoors very well, and you can get a nice plant growing, get some size on it before spring. That way you're harvesting before August. But other things like pumpkins, they do not like to be planted ahead of time. So it doesn't mean you can't. I mean, if you pay enough attention to it and you're an enthusiast, there are ways to start pumpkins inside, maybe a few weeks before, just trying to jumpstart that season. But step one, just write a list. Write a list of all the vegetables you want to grow and the flowers, and then start narrowing down how much you even have room to produce. That way, when you come and see this, and you've got a spinner rack here, a double-sided rack, and then you come around to other racks, it can get overwhelming as far as how many plants and what selections there are. So having a game plan start up front definitely helps. Then you can come down and say, we've started playing around with more of these little packages to help narrow it down. For many of us that are just starting out, it can be a little intimidating walking up to a rack and saying, what do I even want to start with? Well, these little selections narrow it down into what your objectives are. So if you're looking for hummingbirds, which is always a popular item, this is just a selection of seeds that all work well at hummingbird plants. And then herbs, butterflies, sunflowers. But it's not the only way to do it. So if you've been doing this for a while, you've got an idea, you want to grow some peppers, you want to grow some radishes, you want to grow some cucumbers, then you can start just grabbing the seeds and looking at the different pros and cons between the different varieties. The next thing you need to determine in your area when you start looking at seeds, it's not just what you want to grow, but more importantly, what is your last frost date? That's kind of the benchmark that we use for all seeds. So assuming that the majority of these seeds that we sell can be grown indoors over the winter in order to get a jump start on spring. The issue is you don't necessarily want to start them too early or too late. What do I mean by that? Think about it this way. Every region of the world has a frost date. And so here in Rhode Island, many times that's anywhere between, say, May 1st and May 15th, depending on where you are. Here on Aquidneck Island, out in Portsmouth, Newport, very rarely do I ever see a frost in May. But you get 20 minutes, Warren, Bristol, and start going north, you can get frost up to May 15th. Rare, but it can happen. So if you're starting these plants indoors, I usually use the benchmark of around May 15th. That's a good average for Rhode Island. But every one of these seeds is going to tell you on the back of the packet when to plant it, how many weeks to start your seed prior to the last day of frost. And so that's kind of the benchmark. So that way, if you go all the way up to Vermont and say their frost date, maybe June 1st, I don't know, it'll tell you if I need to start that seed 4 weeks before. Now you can just go back. So you kind of need to figure out your region and figure out what the last frost date is yours. And then you can use all the information on the back of the packet of seeds to determine when you should start. All right, so once you've determined when your last frost date is, everything that you need to know to start seeds for a plant is right on the package. I love Botanical Interest. They give you lots of information. And you can see an example here. I've got kind of two ends of the spectrum. Pumpkins, especially these Big Mac pumpkins. It says right on the top, 120 days to frost. What does that mean? Once I plant these in the ground, I need about 120 days of warm growing weather in order to harvest the pumpkin. Whereas these chili peppers only require 60 to 70 days from transplanting until you're going to start picking peppers. And then on the back of each one of these seed racks, it'll give you a little bit of the highlights on the front. Usually the front of the cover is just what are the traits of that plant. But then as you dig into the back, it'll start going through and give you much more detailed information of what you need in order to properly be successful with this crop. So these marigolds, you'll see on the back, it tells you when to sow outside. So that means, am I just putting these seeds directly in the ground and growing them from there? It says 1 to 2 weeks after your average frost when temperature is reaching 70 to 80 degrees. But most of us that are trying to start things inside, we're really just looking at this number here. When to start inside. This particular crop is 4 to 6 weeks before your average last frost date. That means you just pick, if we're May 15th, we're going to go back 4 to 6 weeks prior to that, and that's when you want to plant these plants. If you plant them too early, you're just going to get a really big, leggy plant that needs to get, it's outgrowing its pot, needs to get in the ground, but it may not be warm enough yet to put them outside. So that's why we're really starting with watching this information here. Then we dig a little bit deeper, and it gives you a little bit more information on trying to be successful with the seeds. So days to emerge. So once I plant the seed in the ground, I need 5 to 15 days just for that seed to even start growing. I'm going to plant that seed 1/4 of an inch below the soil, and then I'm going to group these seeds, 3 seeds every 8 inches. So you're going to put 2 or 3 seeds together, let them start sprouting, and then I'm going to space those clusters every 8 inches around. And then botanical interest is great, because if you really want to get more detail on information, you open this up, and usually on the inside of this pack is in even more depth and fine-tuning, maybe some tricks on how to stake the plant, not what it needs for care going beyond the germination phase. All right, so that's kind of it when it comes to selecting your seeds and starting with that. I'll shoot a separate video on fertilizing soils, how to actually construct an area to grow out your plants, what the flowers actually need to be successful and make sure they're growing healthy. The first step is just figuring out what you want to grow. Then figure out getting a schedule as to when those plants need to be started indoors. Some plants are going to be 6 to 8 weeks before that last frost date. Others are going to say, don't do it at all. Like those pumpkins, don't do them at all. It's just much easier to do it right in the ground. The challenge is starting to make a list of what you're growing, get that schedule ready, so then you just start planting in succession what plants you need to be ready at a certain time, because they all are shooting for that frost date. So can you do it beyond that? Absolutely. You'll get plants growing faster if you can start them indoors. But the whole reason for doing all of this is not just to save money, but at the same time, know that by the time spring comes around, you're planting plants that have a healthy root system, that are exactly the cultivars you want, and you've already worked out the schedule. So make your notes, daydream a little bit with the selections, then start thinking about what you have to do in order to make sure they're successful. That's a whole nother video on its own. Hope that helps. Take care. One more thing to consider when it comes to scheduling out in your seeds. You want to look at succession also. There are certain crops like tomatoes that may have a long fruiting period. And so once you get harvesting, you're harvesting a ton of fruit. But then there's other ones like radishes that it's a tiny radish. Some cultivars only take about 24 days to harvest. So we're not typically doing those inside and starting them out in seeds, but I want to harvest them every week. So what you're going to do is start planting them right in the ground and then harvest your radishes 24 days later. So you plant a few, wait a week, plant a few more, wait a week, and keep doing that. And some varieties you can do that on and off all season, so you get a nice succession of harvest, because like a radish, you're eating the root of that plant. So you're not getting multiple radishes from each plant, so you need to plant succession. Any plant that you're starting to do indoors. So even like corn. Corn is another one. Once you harvest the corn, it's not reflowering and refruiting and continuing. So corn's another one that's a little bit slower growing around here. Many people will grow it directly in the ground, but you can start it from seed. So doing it and start thinking about how many plants do I want to harvest at once. If I'm feeding a family of 5 and we're big corn enthusiasts, then I'm going to plant a half dozen or a dozen corn plants. And then I'm going to wait a couple weeks and I'll plant another one. And then just keep doing that. And you can stagger the crop to give you corn over multiple seasons or over multiple harvests over the season. And by starting some of those indoors. Whereas like those Big Macs pumpkins, those are going to be a one-shot deal. They're not necessarily going to be, many times they're picking the fruit off them so that all the energy is going into just a handful of pumpkins. So I'm going to be thinking about that, but I'm not going to do a succession of those Big Macs pumpkins. I'm going to figure out how many plants I want to grow. I'm going to start them indoors, even though it says it doesn't have. There's exceptions to every rule. I just need bigger pots. I need to take bigger precautions. The plant does not like being transplanted. So if you use a biodegradable pot, start those plants in there. That's 120 days of warm weather. And if the ground wants to be warm, so if I'm not planting it till June, that really gets late into hurricane season and many things can happen. So I'm going to start those indoors. I'm only going to do a few plants and I'm not worried about a succession of those. So that's where looking through your calendar and figuring out a game plan of what you want. Once you figured out the harvest dates and if you're going to start them from seed or in the ground, you really want to think about, do you need to do succession plantings or not?